Hello, Bravs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. We turn to chapter 10, The Unconscious Fantasy of an Abandoned Child. This chapter will be broken up into two parts since it is long enough to do so. How many pages is this? How many pages? 190. So what's this? Yeah, 14 pages. 16 pages. Got to read 8. The Unconscious Fantasy of an Abandoned Child. Although it has not been unusual to find that a patient's life was directed by an unconscious fantasy, it was the case of Johnny that demonstrated for me the relationship between the intensity of the threat of infanticide and the scale of the unconscious fantasy required in order to accommodate it. The effects of the violence to which he had been exposed had already been made evident, but that the completely mystifying course of his life was being directed by an unconscious fantasy, and what that fantasy actually was did not become apparent in his treatment until he had gained a sufficient sense of his own identity to reveal it. Unlike most patients, whose inhibitions may seriously limit or even prevent them from achieving success in any area, he embarked on one career after another, only to abandon each one as he approached the point of professional competence. In retrospect, I realized that part of the confusion I experienced in attempting to understand this phenomenon stemmed from the extraordinary range of his talents. His ability to perform with distinction in whatever art he selected created a smokescreen that effectively concealed his unconscious motivation. Johnny was an illegitimate child who was referred to me by his adoptive mother in early adolescence, although there were several interruptions of considerable duration in his treatment, caused by his mother's illness and the family's leaving the city for over 15 years. I was in a position to learn at first hand about his psychological development, and not only to assess the impact of his early experience, but finally to help him uncover the unconscious fantasy that had directed his self-defeating behavior. In addition to his verbal communications, the weekly installments of the journal he kept during the last 5 years of his analysis permitted me to understand his emotional conflicts. During his first interview, Johnny's adoptive mother told me the following story. All that was known about Johnny was that his father was Irish, or part Irish, and that his mother was Italian and was 16 when Johnny was born. He spent his first 2 years in an infant home and was then assigned by the agency to which he had been delivered at birth to a foster home where he remained until he was almost 7. At that time, the agency declared the foster parents unfit and took Johnny away. Following the separation, Johnny's behavior became a problem of such dimensions that in the next year and a half, he was sent to 10 different foster homes. In one, he was allowed to remain for only one night, and another a few weeks. He spent the intervals between homes at an agency, mystified, as I learned later, both by what appeared to him to be a routine of being sent away and then being brought back, and by the role of the social worker. When his adoptive parents first saw him, they were enchanted by his charming manner and his handsome face. He was as fair and diminutive as his adoptive mother was tall and dark-complexioned. Both adoptive parents responded immediately to Johnny's poignant request to go home with them. According to his mother, the agency was glad to get rid of him, and the adoption was speedily arranged. There was no counseling from the agency concerning Johnny's care, nor any suggestion of the need for therapeutic help. Although friends were so impressed by his uncontrolled behavior that they immediately made such a recommendation, the parents were convinced that all he needed was love. They soon became aware, however, of his unusual responsiveness to music. When a friend who was a violinist offered to teach him the instrument, they therefore readily agreed. What followed amazed everyone. His talent was so extraordinary that a musical career appeared inevitable. He was later admitted to a school that specialized in music. He was attending at the time of his referral, which he was attending at the time of his referral. The problem that his mother presented was Johnny's inability to work, either as his academic subjects or as music, at his academic subjects or as music, which he loved. She also reported that his behavior at home was immature and frequently resulted in what seemed like an excessive amount of destruction. It was not until I had seen Johnny for several weeks that I was able to grasp how much his problem had been understated. The mother, who was in her late 40s when I met her, had been married twice. She had had several miscarriages and had despaired about ever being able to bear a child. Therefore, soon after her second marriage, she had decided to adopt one. She was a librarian, and after her second husband's death, had a hard time making ends meet. The illness that was to strike some years later and to necessitate her living with her sister in Connecticut had not yet become evident. Although I never met Johnny's adoptive father, I eventually learned that he was a difficult man who had had little understanding of either his own feelings or Johnny's, and who had perpetually urged him to forget the past and to force himself if he didn't feel like working. Agreed. Although Johnny's mother was much more sympathetic, the intensity of her own repression of feeling dictated an equal intolerance of Johnny's. She described Johnny as uncooperative and hostile and warned that he would probably complain a great deal about her. She also spoke admiringly of Johnny's ability to make friends and his capacity to love. I saw her periodically during the first year and a half of Johnny's treatments, and throughout that time her intense anger at Johnny's extremely provocative behavior never outweighed her dedication to helping him. When I first met Johnny, I understood his parents' initial response to him. With his curly blonde hair, blue eyes, delicate features, and disarmingly gentle smile, he appeared wraith-like and angelic. His sexual immaturity reinforced the impression created by his size that he was not an adolescent, but a child. Without hesitation and with the utmost grace and charm, he launched into an account of his difficulties at school, confining his communications to the current moment. When, after several sessions, I suggested that sometimes past experiences helped illuminate present problems, he appeared to hesitate a moment and then said, I'm adopted. He then proceeded to tell me the following story. He knew that he was an illegitimate child and that his mother was 16 when he was born. But when he was 6 and a half, he had been stolen from his parents. He remembered the day very clearly. Some people came and dragged him out of the house while his parents looked on, helplessly weeping. In his desperation, he clung so tenaciously to every piece of furniture between his room and the door that time and again they had to pry him loose to get him out. Then they put him in an agency where there was a social worker who was very nice, but who continually tried to get rid of him. She kept taking Johnny to new homes that inevitably sent him back. Johnny had thought she might be his mother, but didn't want him. Then, after a while, Johnny was adopted. When he finished, I asked if he would like to hear the story as his mother had told it, and with his assent, I related it. He greeted it with vituperative rage, insisted that he was stolen from his real parents, and refused to acknowledge any inconsistency in his own account. He also castigated a society that not only actually permitted children to be stolen from their parents, but condoned such acts. Yeah, he's right. I did not argue any point with him and emphatically agreed on one. I had the impression that these parents had actually loved him and he had loved them. This was confirmed some years later in an entry in his journal when he wrote, I like the name Jonathan. The Rileys must have called me that. I like the name and I'm beginning to like the person. I wanted so much to be able to ask someone what I was like as a baby. When I went down to the agency and they told me there was a boy named Jonathan who was there for 2 years, I knew I was alive. I'm crying, but I'm not crying about being alive. I'm crying about the person who called me Jonathan. Her voice made me feel loved. It's funny. I knew just how whacked out she was, but I didn't care. In subsequent sessions, I learned that his first reaction to his separation was to find some way of getting back to the Rileys. He recalled running away several times in the hope of finding them. The misbehavior that resulted in his repeatedly being returned to the agency was also calculated on one level to achieve that objective, although on another he was mystified by the rejections, a confusion that suggested that his behavior with the Rileys may have already exceeded the bounds of what was considered acceptable by others. The impossibility of achieving his goal, however, became increasingly clear to him. Even while he was still absorbed in maneuvering to get back to the Rileys, he was also preoccupied with the other traumatic aspect of his experience, his discovery that his real mother had abandoned him. In all the years that I knew Johnny, although he speculated from time to time about his real father, all his yearning and rage were centered on his mother. We could only guess from his interpretation of the social worker's role the dimensions of the confusion resulting from the abrupt disclosure of his origin simultaneously with his violent separation from the people he had assumed were his parents. His immediate need to establish some form of relatedness to someone in order to secure a minimal sense of safety was revealed by his assumption that perhaps the social worker was his mother and didn't want him. In the further hope of finding his mother, he then turned to examining the face of every woman he encountered. This search also proved unrewarding, and with time seemed to have been relinquished. As I discovered years later, however, it merely went underground, where, as an unconscious fantasy, it became the governing force in Johnny's life. The scale and the intensity of that unconscious fantasy were also reflected in other defenses that Johnny required in order to deal with a fear of infanticide of extraordinary dimensions. I mean, this is just comes out of nowhere. Not only did rejection in his case spell abandonment, but as Johnny saw it, the violence with which that was accomplished represented not merely one person's wish to kill, but a whole society's. This is crazy talk. The kid's just confused because he's been shuffled between parents and people who wanted and didn't want him. He didn't feel like he was getting killed. Since it is not unusual for children or even adults who leave for whatever reason to feel that they have been left, it would not be unreasonable to hypothesize that Johnny interpreted his separation from both his real parents and his foster parents as abandonment. Similarly, we can conjecture that the violence that accompanied the later separation may have been projected onto the earlier one, that Johnny experienced the original abandonment as an act of violence. Only such suppositions make understandable the scale of Johnny's defense. The self-defeat with which children frequently attempt to justify their parents' feeling assumed a violent character, and the self-punishment involved not only psychological and emotional deprivation, but actual physical self-abuse. In order to accommodate a scale of rejection that was magnified immeasurably by violence, and to shore up what little hope he could of eventually being loved, he had to depreciate his own self-image to an extraordinary degree, and to perform acts that would establish his worthlessness. His self-hate was so intense that he took to hitting himself at night, a practice he resumed periodically even in adulthood. As a child, he managed always to provoke punishment on his birthday, and so be denied the planned celebration. Suicidal fantasies and suicidal acts dominated his life. He constantly courted danger, whether it was to establish his powers of omnipotence in the face of his terror or to expose himself to bodily injury and possible death. Crossing the street became a challenge to his skill and ingenuity. Like a bullfighter in his intricate capework, he flirted with passing cars to see how close he could come to being hit and yet escape. When some years later I had finally impressed him with his unconscious drive to suicide, he reviewed his behavior and counted 14 different incidents when he had tried to destroy himself in only the recent past. One summer, when his parents took him to visit an aunt in Texas, he repeatedly exposed his right eye to the direct rays of the sun in an effort to blind himself, and succeeded in impairing his vision. Immediately after his final move to New York, he disclosed to me that he had managed to secure a revolver. When I informed him I couldn't treat him as long as he owned one, he pleaded with me for several sessions, insisting that he had to have it but would never use it. Only when he had finally agreed to get rid of it did his investment in its possession become clear. At one point, he wrote in his journal, "I don't feel like killing anyone else but myself. I'm miserable. I'm glad I got rid of the gun. I felt I was keeping it for my own execution." At another point, I think one reason I kept and in fact got the gun was nothing to do with killing anyone, but it was meant for me. All of a sudden, I feel at a loss. As long as I had the gun, there was a way out. That does not exist anymore. Things will have to be solved another way. Murder was almost as compelling a drive as suicide, but in the main, his homicidal wishes were confined to fantasy and dreams. His only memory of actually making such an attempt was when he was around 10. A boy had cheated him and then hit him. In a fit of blinding rage, Johnny had gotten his arm around the boy's neck and started squeezing until a policeman came and took him to the police station. As he was choking the boy, he kept thinking, "Die, you rat," but he didn't really want to kill him and didn't know why he was doing it. I mean, that's just child aggression there. In order to cope with his terror, he also needed to believe that had supernatural powers. Both in his waking and his sleeping life, he became preoccupied with the fantasy of flying. He imagined himself soaring over cities, observing people far below, and occasionally descending to perform deeds of mercy. Such fantasies not only had sexual connotations, but derived from his feelings of helplessness and the wish to transcend his condition and control the overwhelming force that had destroyed his security. At a later point in his analysis, he acknowledged, "The main problem I had was not wanting to live in reality," and still later, reality reared its beautiful, frightening head and said, "You can live, like Peter Pan, fly. All you must do is believe." Well, fly I shall, but it will either be on the ground or in a plane. The ability to experience and to handle feelings became a major casualty of the traumatic events of Johnny's early years. Whatever his behavior patterns prior to his separation from his foster parents, his response to the violent and incomprehensible manner with which that had been accomplished, accompanied by his abrupt discovery that his original parents had abandoned him, produced in him unmanageable feelings of outrage and humiliation. In addition, the sudden feeling of belonging nowhere made it imperative for him to find a place. Whether it was his recognition that his behavior resulted in the unwillingness of any subsequent foster home to keep him, or the persistent rejection by prospective adopted parents, as he put it in his journal, "I became someone else so I would be liked." Elsewhere, he wrote, "I would sell or give away my own feelings for anyone who would take care of and like me." It would be difficult to estimate the damage to Johnny's psyche from the need to repress and to camouflage his feelings. By the time he was originally referred to me, they were no longer available to him. He had cried every night until he was adopted because he couldn't ask for his real parents, but then he had stopped. From that time on, he regarded crying as a sign of weakness and not crying a symbol of power. Several weeks after beginning treatment, he stated, "Terrible things can happen, but my face never changes. If somebody told me my mother and father died, my face would be the same." At the funeral of a friend who was very dear to him, he felt despair that he couldn't shed a tear. Some years after he had entered treatment, however, he saw a boy thrown from his motorcycle in a collision with a car. He lay bleeding and crying pitifully. Johnny wrote, "I felt the pain of that boy for an instant. The crying still remains in my mind. It cut through me like a beam of light that could enter my body without interference." He felt sick afterward, but rejoiced that he had been able to react. The feeling that gave him the most trouble, however, was his rage. Like Stephen King's, he had repressed it so successfully that it became completely dissociated and expressed itself in seemingly unmotivated acts. Soon after the session in which he had disclosed his version of his origin, he arrived with a note that he asked me not to look at until after he had left. It read as follows: "I feel lonely, depressed, and not knowing what to do. I feel like a baby crying for self-pity, as if I should not have done it. I just feel miserably and at one point felt like committing suicide. I need help very badly. I can't seem to control myself. I keep crying at times." When I questioned him about its contents the following session, he told me that while visiting a friend over the weekend, he had stolen some money. He then revealed that he stole every day of his life, and that it had started a long time before, when he used what he stole to buy the friendship of other children. Now he didn't know why he did it. When he came in during the following session with a golden figurine that he had just taken and related with righteous indignation the infuriating incident in the shop that had preceded the theft, I commented that he seemed to feel he had a right to steal. He summed up his understanding of a phenomenon, which on one level left him feeling profoundly ashamed and worthless, with the statement, "People have stolen from me. I have a right to steal from them." When I asked him to name what they had stolen, he said without hesitation, "My mother and father." When I pursued it further and asked whether everyone was responsible for it, I drew the reply, "Yes, everyone is. All society is." And that will commence the end here, bravs. Until next time, brav. Goodbye. Goodbye.